what do you think when you hear the word emperor? Okay, now imagine we live in a world where pop culture franchises don't infect our every thought. What would you think now? Probably something along these lines. Well-dressed, well-coiffed, classy men with good posture and regal bearing. If you're ruling an entire empire, it's pretty important that you look the part. These were the days before photography. People wouldn't believe you were the emperor unless you wore fancier clothes than everybody else, lived in a fancier house than everybody else, and had more shiny things pinned to your chest than everybody else. Which is what makes this guy so interesting. Star Wars' iconic Emperor Palpatine doesn't appear in the original 1977 film. He's obliquely referred to a couple of times, but for the most part, his galactic empire is represented to us by his subordinates. And for the most part, those subordinates look appropriate to their positions. Snappily dressed and well-groomed fascist officers who oversee galaxy-wide oppression with a stiff upper lip. Their uniforms are clean and pressed to give them a sense of efficient superiority, but dull-colored and unornamented to imply sterility and conformity. It's no secret that the costumes of the Imperial officers were inspired by the uniforms of the Third Reich, probably the evilest real-world empire in living memory. And they almost all have upper-crust English accents, which evokes the globe-spanning British Empire that conquered peoples beyond count. In short, they look and sound like what you would expect of them. They draw on historical visual parallels, given a science fiction update, to evoke the image of an empire in space. There's one guy who stands out, and that's Vader, with his angular black armor and floor-length cape. But in the original Star Wars, Vader comes off as the exception to the rule among an empire with a very specific aesthetic. In Star Wars media sense, Vader is routinely portrayed as one of the Empire's top dogs. But in the original film, he comes off almost like an outsider. Officers question him and outright insult him to his face, and he can be ordered around like he's hired muscle. Remember that there's no mention of the Sith in the original trilogy. All we know about the formation of the Empire is that it succeeded the Old Republic, and that Vader, a devotee of the dark side of the Force, sided with it over the Jedi Knights. But A New Hope gives us the impression that this is largely an alliance of convenience, that Vader is tolerated within the Empire for his effectiveness, even as his religion makes him a target of mockery. So, imagine it's 1977, and you're my dad, and you've seen the original Star Wars 17 times. You might be wondering to yourself what this Emperor of the Galactic Empire looks like, and you'd probably expect something like this. He'd probably look somewhat like Tarkin, but with a bigger chest of medals. He'd look regal and clean-cut and respectable. He'd certainly look more like his officers than like Vader, who seems to be the odd duck in his regime. But then Empire came out, and we got our first look at the guy. And then Return of the Jedi followed it and stuck to the same design, though they recast the part with the now iconic Emperor actor Ian McDiarmid. And this? Well, this doesn't look like an Emperor. He wears a simple black robe, he keeps a hood up over his face, and he looks sickly and grotesque. There's no regality or majesty to him at all. And not only does he not look like an emperor, he doesn't even really look like he belongs in a science fiction film. Think about it. If you cut Emperor Palpatine out of Star Wars and pasted him into Middle-earth, would he look out of place at all? There's nothing about his design that appears futuristic. He'd be at home next to the Ringwraiths. What he really looks like is a witch. He doesn't seem like someone who should be managing a vast galactic bureaucracy. He seems like he should be hidden away in a dark lair working foul magics around his cauldron. He belongs in the Middle Ages, not a high-tech space station. And that's what's so damn cool about this character design, because it makes us rethink our entire impression of what the Galactic Empire is. This is not just any fascist government led by a charismatic strongman. This is an institution that is, in a spiritual sense, evil at its core. Evil is not just a byproduct of its authoritarian ideology. Evil is the ideology. Because there is no way that this man is under any delusions about which side he's on. In doing so, it creates an inconsistency that's kind of difficult to address. Now, I'm no expert on the Star Wars expanded universe, so if you are, tell me. Does Palpatine preside over the Senate and meet with diplomats and bureaucrats looking like this? Does he appear at state functions and on television looking like the goddamn Grim Reaper? The Bad Batch says he does, but Star Wars Rebels implies that he outwardly presents himself as a more proper-looking emperor when speaking to those outside his inner circle. Which seems to make more sense, because who could possibly accept being ruled by a man who openly revels in the aesthetic of villainy? Imagine if Joe Biden started dressing and talking like this. it would not do wonders for his approval ratings. Okay, maybe it would at first because it would be kinda rad, but once the novelty wore off, you'd start to question the guy's intentions. But even if it doesn't make a lot of sense from an in-universe perspective, this design tells you all you need to know about the character from a single glance. There is not a speck of good in this man, and thus there is not a speck of good in his empire. It is an institution not just corrupt, but spiritually evil, explicitly allied with metaphysical forces of darkness. Remember also that Palpatine isn't named until the prequel trilogy. In the original films, he's just the Emperor, as if he weren't a man at all, but a physical manifestation of the concept of tyranny. And what this does is elevate Star Wars as a whole. It is, in fact, even more than a story about brave rebels fighting an oppressive government. The Galactic Civil War is merely a proxy for a far older, never-ending battle between the opposed light and dark sides of the Force. Vader, in his dark side worship, ceases to be an outsider in the Empire and instead becomes the truest representation of its power. Because Star Wars isn't science fiction. Not really. It's not about science and technology and the future of man. It's about good and evil, and corruption and redemption, and magic. It's a fantasy story set in space. And usually it hides that fact pretty well, but with the character design of Emperor Palpatine, it puts it right out in the open. The moral is the character design is important and that the Emperor is a cool character. Still dumb that he came back in Rise of Skywalker, though. See you next time!